Okay, today's lesson is on fractions as decimals. So to begin, we've got a few simple fractions up here, and all we're going to do is write these fractions as decimals. Well, if you remember your place value that we learned at the beginning of the year, the ones column is always right in front of the decimal, and then the first place value behind the decimal is the tenths. After that are the hundredths and then the thousands, but right now we're just going to use the tenths and the hundredths. So if I have 1/10 as a fraction, to write that as a decimal, all I would do is put that fraction in the correct place value. So 1/10, I would put the 1 in the tenths place and put a 0 here in front of the decimal. 0.1 is the same thing as 1/10. I'm going to go ahead and erase that so I can do the next one. The next problem is 7/10, the next fraction. So again, 7 in the tenths place. Here's my tenths place, so I put a 7 there, and I put a 0 in front of the decimal. 0.7 is 7/10. The next fraction is 32 hundredths. So I look at my fraction, and I always pay attention to the denominator because that's going to indicate what place value my numerator should be in. So I know that I have 32 hundredths, so I know that the last digit in my numerator should end in the hundredths place. So it should be 0.32. That reads 32 hundredths because my last digit ends in the hundredths place. And for my final fraction, I have 9 hundredths. So to write 9 hundredths as a decimal, again, I pay attention to the bottom, the denominator, and the denominator is of 100, so I know that my fraction has to end in the hundredths place. I only have one digit this time, but I know that that digit has to go in the hundredths place, so I'm going to do that first. I'm going to put 9 in the hundredths place. And since that's my only digit, I put zeros in the other two places just as placeholders. So it's 0.09, and the 9 is in the hundredths place, so I know that that is 9 hundredths. All right, let's move on. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is look at base 10 blocks. We've worked with those a lot in class, so we're going to use those today to represent decimals. So here I have my base 10 blocks, and I've shaded in some parts of each of them. So let's work with the first base 10 block. This base 10 block represents a flat. That's what we call them in math class. And right now I've got 2 longs shaded in. So I have 2 out of 10 longs. 10 longs, this is a long, 10 longs make up 1 flat. This is a flat. So right now I've got 2 out of 10 shaded in. So that would equal 2 tenths because I have 2 out of 10 shaded in. And to write that as a decimal, I would write 0.2. Putting my 2 in the tenths place. Another way to write this is that I have 20 single cubes. These, let's see, go back to my cursor. There are 100 of these single cubes in one flat. So right now I've got 20 single cubes shaded in. So that means that I have 2 tenths, or I could write it as 20 hundredths. And 20 hundredths, written as a decimal, is just 0.20. These are the same things, 20 hundredths and 2 tenths. So I could write this either way. All right, let's move on to the next one. On the next flat, I have 5 longs shaded in. Oh, actually I have 4 longs shaded in. I meant to shade in 5, so I'm going to change that. Okay? So I'm going to change it so that I have 5 long shaded in. There we go. Get back here. Okay, so I have 5 out of 10 long shaded in, so I know that that's 5/10. And to write 5/10 as a decimal, I would just write 0.5. This is also the same thing as saying 50 hundredths, because I have 50 little squares shaded in out of 100. So I could write it as 5/10, or I could write it as 50 hundredths. And the decimal for 50 hundredths is just 0.50. So I know that 50 hundredths and 5/10 is the same thing. I could write it either way. Coming down here, in this flat, this base 10 block, I don't have any complete long shaded in. And remember, this is a long. Oh, back to my cursor. This is a long, and I don't have a complete long shaded in, so I'm going to count by individual cubes, and I have 25 little cubes shaded in. I know that there are 100 cubes in this entire thing, so I have 25 out of 100 shaded in. So the fraction would be 25 hundredths. To write that as a decimal, I would just make sure that the 5, the last digit, ends in the hundredths place. So it would be 0.25. Moving on to the next one. Over here, I have 4 longs shaded in, but then I have these little halves shaded in. So I think I'm going to stick with just counting the individual cubes instead of worrying about the longs, since not all of these lines go straight across. So when I look at this diagram, I have 75 little cubes shaded in. There are 100, actually, this one should be shaded in too. I just caught a mistake. Let's see. Back to cursor mode. Oh, it's not going to let me do that. Okay. Well, anyway, we'll just start over here. I'll use this pen. Okay, so I had 75 shaded in. 1, 2, 3. This is a little sloppy, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows, and then this was all shaded in. Okay, so I apologize for the sloppiness, but that's 75 little cubes out of 100 shaded in. So that would be represented by 75 hundredths, because 75 out of 100 are colored, and that would equal 0.75. My last digit needs to end in the hundredths place, and it does, 0.75. All right, let's go back to another problem. And I'm going to erase all this. Here we have decimals, and I want you to do the opposite of what we have been practicing. Instead of writing the fractions as decimals, this time we're going to write the decimals as fractions. And if you know how to read a decimal, then you know how to write it as a fraction. Alright, so we're going to start here with 0.8. The 8 is in the tenths place, so this would be the same thing as 8 tenths. Here we have 0.2. The 2 is in the tenths place, so this would be the same thing as 2 tenths. This is 6 tenths, so I would write it as 6/10. This one's a little different. The 7 is not in the tenths place, it's in the hundredths place. So I have 7 out of 100, 7 hundredths. So I'd write it as 7/100. And same for this. The 9 is in the hundredths place value, so I would write it as 9 hundredths. Okay, moving on. Alright, so these should look familiar to you. These are the same yellow base 10 blocks that we use in class for many different things. And if you remember from earlier, this is called a flat, and it represents 100 because there are 100 little cubes in this whole thing. This is called a long, and it represents 10 units. And this is called a cube, and it represents 1 unit. So we're going to be using these tomorrow in class to represent place value, decimals, and fractions. But let's review here. Let's say I have 5 longs shaded in. So I have 5 out of 10 longs shaded in. I could write that as 5/10, or I could count the number of cubes I have shaded in, and it would be 50 out of 100. So I could write it as 5/10 or 50 hundredths. The only difference in decimals is that 5/10 would be 0.5 and 50 hundredths would be 0.50. Alright, let's move on. Okay, here are your 2 practice problems for this evening. Tonight you're going to write 5 hundredths in decimal form, and your second practice problem is a little more difficult. It's going to require a little more time. You're going to show 2 tenths by drawing base 10 blocks. So remember, that would be 2 out of 10 longs, okay? And then think about how many cubes that would be. So show 2 tenths by drawing base 10 blocks, then write the decimal for 2 tenths. Good luck!